In the quiet countryside, the moon hung low in the sky, casting a pale light over the sprawling fields. An old, weathered barn stood at the edge of a small farm, its creaking timbers a reminder of years gone by. Inside, old Mrs. Hargrove sat on a rickety chair beside a flickering oil lamp, knitting to pass the time. At her feet, her new puppy Rusty dozed peacefully, his tiny chest rising and falling with each breath. The night had a strange stillness to it, the kind that made the hairs on the back of her neck prickle. She was no stranger to the eerie quiet of the countryside, but tonight, something felt off. A sudden thump echoed from the barn's loft above. Mrs. Hargrove froze, her knitting needles pausing mid-stitch. Rusty lifted his head, his ears perked, and let out a low, uncertain growl. "Who's there?" Mrs. Hargrove called out, her voice wavering but firm. Silence answered. She reached for the old shotgun she kept by the door, her arthritic hands trembling as she gripped it. Slowly, she stood up and glanced at Rusty. "Come on, boy," she whispered. The puppy trotted at her side, his little body tense and alert. They moved toward the ladder leading to the loft. The barn was ancient, its wooden boards creaking with each step she took. As she reached the bottom of the ladder, another noise came from above, a soft, metallic scraping, followed by a strange guttural sound she had never heard before. Her heart pounded in her chest as she slowly climbed the ladder, the shotgun slung over her shoulder. When her head peeked over the edge of the loft, she gasped. Standing in the shadows was something otherworldly. The creature was tall, its skin a deep, shimmering silver under the moonlight. Large, almond-shaped eyes glowed with an eerie light, and long, slender fingers extended from its hands, which were touching a strange, glowing object that floated in midair. The alien looked up suddenly, sensing her presence. For a moment, Mrs. Hargrove was paralyzed with fear. She had heard stories, seen news about UFOs and strange sightings, but never in her wildest dreams had she imagined this. She raised the shotgun, but her hands shook so badly she wasn't sure she could fire it. The creature let out a sharp, otherworldly screech, its fingers twitching in a way that made her stomach turn. In a panic, Mrs. Hargrove fumbled with the gun, but Rusty, sensing the danger, let out a ferocious bark, one far too loud and deep for his size. The alien flinched at the sound, and in a sudden, lightning-fast movement, it lunged toward her. Mrs. Hargrove stumbled back, her finger pulling the trigger by accident. The blast echoed through the barn, hitting nothing but air as the alien dodged the shot. She fell back onto the loft floor, the gun slipping from her hands. In the chaos, Rusty leapt forward, snapping at the alien's ankles. His tiny teeth didn't stand a chance against the alien's tough skin, but his fierce determination was enough to distract the creature. It let out another screech, stumbling back as Rusty barked and growled, his small body a blur of motion. With the alien momentarily off balance, Mrs. Hargrove regained her wits. She scrambled to her feet and, with a sudden burst of courage, grabbed the nearest thing she could find, a rusted pitchfork leaning against the wall. She charged, jabbing it at the alien, catching it by surprise. The sharp prongs grazed its arm, causing it to stagger back, its glowing eyes wide with shock. The alien let out one final, piercing wail, and in a flash of light, it vanished, leaving behind a faint hum and the strange object that had been floating in the air. Mrs. Hargrove stood there, panting, gripping the pitchfork tightly. Rusty, his tail wagging furiously now, barked triumphantly at the empty space where the creature had been. She sank down to the floor, pulling Rusty into her lap. "Well, boy," she whispered, stroking his soft fur, "I think we just saved the world. Or at least this old barn." The two sat there for a long moment, the quiet returning to the night as if nothing had happened. But Mrs. Hargrove knew something had changed. She had faced the unknown, and though fear had gripped her, it was her wits and the bravery of a little puppy that had saved her life.